The moment Lenora Crawford walked into Harlan's General Store on that sweltering Tuesday in the summer of 1883, every conversation in the building stopped, as though God himself had pressed a thumb against the throat of the town of Redrock, Texas, and squeezed. She had grown used to that silence. The way it arrived before the whispers did, the way it blanketed the room in something thick and suffocating, a silence that was not the respectful kind one offered a widow or a grieving mother, but the leering, judgmental kind that men and women both wielded like a weapon when they believed a woman had stepped outside the boundaries they'd drawn for her. Lenora kept her chin up. She had learned to do that much, to keep her chin level with the horizon and her eyes fixed somewhere beyond the faces that watched her with that particular mixture of pity and contempt that had become as familiar to her as the smell of her own kitchen. She placed her basket on the counter and unfolded the list she had written in careful, deliberate script. Flour, salt, 2 yards of calico if the blue was still in, a spool of thread. She read each item to herself silently and then looked up at old Franklin Harlan, who stood behind the counter with his arms crossed and his expression arranged into the particular shape it always took when she came in. Not unkind, exactly. More like a man who had decided that being halfway decent to her was an act of charity he was willing to extend, though he wanted her to understand it cost him something. "Morning, Lenora," he said. "Morning, Mr. Harlan," she replied, and her voice did not shake. It had not shaken in over 2 years, not since the night everything that made up her life before had collapsed around her and left her standing in the rubble of a reputation she had never actually earned. She was 26 years old, and she had been branded ruined by every man in the county. It had started with Thomas Eldridge. Thomas, who had been handsome and confident, and who had come courting her with flowers picked from the meadow south of the Crawford property, who had kissed her behind the church one Sunday in April of 1881, and told her she was the finest woman in Redrock. Thomas, who had then spent the following weeks telling every man who would listen that Lenora Crawford was a woman of loose moral character, a woman who had offered herself to him freely and without the sanction of marriage, a woman who was, in the language of that time and place, ruined. None of it was true. Not a single syllable of it. He had kissed her once, and she had not invited that kiss, but what Thomas Eldridge said had been believed because Thomas Eldridge was the son of the county's largest cattle rancher and Lenora Crawford was the daughter of a farmer who had died owing debts to half the men in town. The mathematics of social standing in Redrock, Texas were not complicated. Money bought truth. Poverty bought the opposite. What followed Thomas's story was a cascade of additions. Men who had never spoken to Lenora, men who barely knew her name, found themselves adding their own embellishments to the growing story, each one trying to outdo the last in the particular way that small-town cruelty operates, building a fiction so tall and elaborate that the woman at the center of it became almost fictional herself. By the end of that first year, Lenora Crawford existed in the collective imagination of Redrock as something between a ghost and a cautionary tale, a woman you pointed to when you wanted to warn your daughters about what happened to girls who didn't guard themselves carefully enough. She had fought it at first, had gone to Reverend Aldous at the Presbyterian church and asked for his help, and he had looked at her with those sad, watery eyes, and told her that the best thing she could do was pray and comport herself with dignity, and let time do its healing work. She had gone to Sheriff Boone, who had listened politely, and then told her there was no law against men talking. She had written a letter to the county newspaper, the Redrock Courier, explaining what had actually occurred, and the editor, a man named Delbert Price, had crumpled it up in front of her and suggested she think carefully about whether stirring the pot was in her best interest. So she had learned to live inside the story they'd written about her. She kept to herself on her small farm 3 miles east of town, the land her father had left her along with his debts, which she was slowly, methodically paying off. She raised chickens and grew vegetables and sold eggs and preserved fruit, and did whatever work she could find that didn't require her to stand before too many eyes for too long. She was not broken. She wanted that to be understood, even if no one was listening. She was not broken. She was just very, very tired. Franklin Harlan filled her order without further conversation, wrapping the calico in brown paper and stacking the flour sack and salt beside it. And Lenora counted out her coins and placed them on the counter, with the precision of someone who had counted every penny that passed through her hands for 2 years running. She was lifting her basket when the door behind her opened and let in a blast of July heat along with the sound of boots on the wooden floor, slow and deliberate, the kind of walk that belonged to a man who was comfortable in whatever room he entered. She did not turn around at first. She was accustomed to not turning around, to making herself small and efficient and gone before the social architecture of whatever space she occupied could arrange itself into something that required her to navigate it. "Mr. Harlan," said a voice she did not recognize, and it was a good voice, a voice that was low without being rough, the kind of voice that had patience built into its very construction. "I was told you're the man to talk to about getting established in this town." Lenora picked up her basket and turned to leave because that was what she did, but in the narrow space between the counter and the shelf of tobacco and dry goods, she found herself directly in the path of the man who had just entered, and she looked up at him before she could remind herself not to meet anyone's eyes. He was tall. That was the first thing. Tall in the way that rangy men from the plains were tall, like the land had stretched him out to match its own proportions. He had dark hair that was just beginning to show the first threads of gray at the temples, though he couldn't have been more than 33 or 34, and a face that was weathered but not harsh, the kind of face that had spent years under an open sky and had been shaped by it into something honest. He wore a trail-worn brown duster and a hat that had seen considerable use, and he was looking at her with brown eyes that were warm and direct, and entirely lacking in the particular calculation she had grown used to seeing in the eyes of men in Redrock when they looked at her. He stepped to the side immediately to clear her path. "Pardon me, ma'am," he said, and he touched the brim of his hat, and there was nothing in his voice or his posture that suggested he knew who she was or what she had supposedly done, or what brand the county had pressed into her character. "Thank you," she said, and she walked out the door and didn't look back. She thought about those eyes for 3 days. His name was Alfred Hayes, and he had arrived in Redrock with $100 in his pocket, a horse named Clement, 2 changes of clothes, a battered copy of a survey map, and the absolute conviction that this particular corner of the Texas Hill Country was where he intended to build something permanent. He had been moving for 6 years, since he'd come back from working the cattle drives up from San Antonio, and found that the restlessness those years of travel had planted in him had grown roots of its own, had made it impossible for him to simply settle back into the farm in Oklahoma where he'd grown up. He had worked as a hired hand in 3 counties and as a trail cook for a season, and had spent 18 months learning carpentry from a German immigrant outside of San Marcos. And now, he was 32 years old and he wanted land, and he wanted to stay in one place long enough to learn every tree on it by name. He had picked Redrock almost at random, which was to say he had asked questions in 4 towns along the road, and Redrock was the one where a fair-minded answer had come back to him about the land prices and the water situation and the quality of the soil in the eastern parcels. He rented a room above the livery stable from a man named Josiah Prout, who was taciturn but not unfriendly, and he began the business of looking at properties with the intention of buying something before the summer ended. It was on the 2nd day of his looking that he heard the name Lenora Crawford for the first time. He was sitting in the Red Horse Saloon, not drinking but nursing a cup of the terrible coffee they served to men who wanted company without liquor, and he was listening to the kind of conversation that men have when they think the newcomer isn't paying attention. It was Thomas Eldridge's cousin, a soft-faced man named Roy Eldridge, who said it first. "You want to watch yourself with the Crawford woman if you happen across her," Roy said to the man sitting beside him, a drover who had just ridden in from the south. "She's the kind that seems respectable enough on the outside." The drover said something Alfred couldn't quite make out. "Every man in this county knows about her," Roy continued, with the satisfied certainty of someone delivering a verdict that has already been widely confirmed. "Tom Eldridge, Bill Sutter, Pete Carr, the Haverson brothers, half a dozen more. She's not a bad-looking woman, I'll give her that, but she's no better than she ought to be." Alfred Hayes set his coffee cup down and looked at Roy Eldridge with the particular quality of attention that tended to make people uncomfortable if they were saying something they knew, on some level, they shouldn't be saying. "How many of those men would you put your hand on a Bible and vouch for?" Alfred asked. Roy looked over at him, surprised to be addressed directly. "What's that?" "I'm asking how many of the men you just named you'd trust to tell the truth about a woman if the truth didn't suit them," Alfred said. He said it without heat, conversationally, the way he might ask about the price of timber. Roy opened his mouth and then closed it. The man beside him looked away. Alfred picked his coffee up again and did not press the point. He was new here, and he understood that being new was its own kind of vulnerability, and that the way to learn a place was not to announce your opinions about it before you'd had time to understand what you were actually looking at. But he filed the name away. Lenora Crawford. He had seen her in Harlan's store that first morning, had noticed her the way you noticed a person who was working very hard to make themselves invisible, and who was not quite succeeding because there was something in the way she held herself that refused to fully disappear. The land Alfred eventually settled on was 160 acres of good hill country east of Redrock, and it happened, as these things do in small counties, to share a fence line with a smaller parcel of 30-odd acres that belonged, the land agent told him while shuffling his papers, to a Miss Lenora Crawford. Alfred said, "Is that right?" and signed the papers and rode out to look at what he had bought. He found the fence line first, a post-Andreal affair that had seen better days, several of the rails leaning or fallen entirely, and beyond it a modest farm that showed the evidence of genuine hard work in its tidy vegetable garden and its repaired outbuildings, even if it also showed the strain of one person trying to manage everything alone. The farmhouse itself was small but solid, and there was a woman moving in the yard with a basket of laundry, pinning shirts to a line strung between two cedar posts. He did not call out to her. He rode the perimeter of his own land that afternoon and made his plans and went back to Josiah Pruitt's loft above the livery. And the next morning, he drove a borrowed wagon out to the east parcel and began the first of what would be many days of work. He had been there 4 days before he saw her up close again. She had come to the fence line because 3 of her chickens had apparently found a gap in the rails and wandered onto his property, and she was leaning over the fallen rail trying to shoo them back without climbing through herself, her face set in the expression of someone managing a minor catastrophe with the patience of long experience. Alfred was close enough to see her before she saw him, and he watched for a moment, not because he was being secretive, but because there was something in the scene that was simply human and honest, a woman and her chickens and the quiet comedy of it. "I can catch them for you," he said. She startled and straightened, and he saw the familiar preparation in her eyes, the assembling of whatever armor she'd built for herself. But he had already moved past her toward the chickens with the purposeful calm of a man who had caught chickens before, because he had, many times, and within 2 minutes, he had all 3 of them tucked under his arm and was holding them out to her over the fence. "Thank you," she said, taking them with the efficient grip of someone experienced with livestock. "I'm Alfred Hayes," he said. "I bought the east parcel last week. I'll be your neighbor." "I know who you are," she said. "Mr. Harlan mentioned it." She paused, and he saw the calculation happening, the assessment of whether this man was going to be one more problem arranged along her borders or something neutral. "I'm Lenora Crawford." "I know who you are too," he said, and he watched something shift in her expression, a tightening around her eyes that he recognized as the bracing for impact. "You've got a good tidy farm. I noticed the fence line needs some work on this stretch. I'll see to the rails on my side if you're agreeable." She stared at him for a moment as though she was trying to find the angle in what he'd said, the place where the ordinary words bent into something else. "That's a fair offer," she said finally. "Good," he said. He picked up his hammer and went back to work, and he felt her watching him for a moment before she went back to her own yard. The fence rails were the beginning of things. He fixed the rails on his side over the course of a Saturday, working steadily through the morning heat, and when he came to the stretch closest to her property line, he found that she had already replaced the two most badly damaged posts on her side with new cedar, the earth around their bases still dark and fresh-turned. He stood and looked at the work she'd done, and thought that she was stronger than she probably looked to people who only saw the surface of things. He did not seek her out. He understood that seeking her out would be a presumption, and more than that, he understood from the little he'd observed, and the much more he'd pieced together from the things people in Redrock said, and didn't say, that Lenora Crawford had been approached by men with purposes she'd had good reason not to trust. He went about his building with the methodical patience that was native to his character, clearing the land where he wanted his barn, setting posts for the corral, laying in the supplies he'd need for the house he was planning to build on the high ground of the parcel, with its good view of the cedar-covered hills to the west. He met her again the following week at Harlan's general store, and this time he was there when Roy Eldridge's cutting remark about her reached him from across the store, delivered in a voice calculated to be heard. Something about women without shame having their grocery lists. As Lenora stood at the counter with her back straight, and her face composed in that particular way she had, the way that cost her something he could see it costing her. Alfred set down the box of nails he was inspecting and walked to the counter and stood beside her and said to Franklin Harlan, "I need 100 pounds of flour and a good 50 of cornmeal, and if you've got any of that baking soda, I'll take a case of it." And he said it at a normal volume to Harlan, but his position beside Lenora was deliberate, and Harlan looked from one of them to the other and said nothing, and Roy Eldridge said nothing more, and the store went about its business. Lenora did not look at Alfred, but when they both happened to leave at the same time and were loading their respective wagons in the street outside, she said quietly without looking at him, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," he said. "It won't make them think better of me," she said. "It'll just give them something new to say." "I don't much care what they say," Alfred said. He climbed up onto his wagon seat. "Good afternoon, Miss Crawford." She looked at him then directly, and he met her eyes, and he thought she was one of the most genuinely dignified people he had ever encountered, and that dignity had nothing to do with what the county had decided about her. "Good afternoon, Mr. Hayes," she said, and she drove her wagon east and he watched her go. Through the rest of July and into August, he built his barn, and he began clearing the foundation for his house, and the routine of the work grounded him in the land the way he'd hoped it would. He came to know his property section by section, the way the creek that ran along the south edge dropped after rain, the particular tilt of the light through the cedar trees in the late afternoon, the way the wind came off the hills from the northwest in the early morning, with a coolness that the day would swallow by 9. He bought 2 more horses to go with Clement, and 4 head of cattle to start his herd, and he began to feel the first solid stirrings of permanence. He saw Lenora at a distance 3 or 4 times a week. He was not watching for her exactly, but their properties shared enough boundary that it was natural to notice when she was working her garden, or moving her chickens between pens, or making the slow circle of her small herd of 4 goats along the creek that ran between their land. He noticed that she worked from before sunrise until after sunset on most days. He noticed that she had no help, that no one came to assist her with the heavier work, that the men who occasionally appeared on the road past her property did not stop with offers of neighborliness. He noticed that she was very much alone, and that she managed her aloneness with the same precise competence she managed everything else, as though she had made a decision at some point to simply be sufficient unto herself, and had committed to that decision with her whole character. In the middle of August, he had occasion to use that carpentry he'd learned in San Marcos. He was splitting cedar rails for his corral fence late in the afternoon when he heard the crack and crash from the direction of her property, and then the sound of something heavy hitting the ground, and then silence. He waited for a moment and heard no further sound and no voice calling out, and something about the silence was wrong in the way that a silence after an accident can be wrong, and he set down his maul and went to the fence line and looked over. The hen house on her property had partially collapsed. The front corner post had given way, bringing the front wall down, and the structure was leaning badly to one side, and Lenora was inside it in the wreckage, trying to push the fallen wall section up with her shoulder while also keeping herself from being pinned. She was not hurt, or at least not badly hurt, but she was thoroughly stuck and straining with everything she had against a piece of lumber that was significantly heavier than she was. Alfred went through the fence without stopping to think about it and crossed her yard and went into the wreckage beside her and put his hands against the wall section and heaved it up off her and propped it with his shoulder long enough for her to step clear. They stood in the ruined hen house, both of them breathing hard from the effort, and her hair had come half out of its pins, and there was a line of blood on her forearm where a nail had grazed her, and she was looking at the damage with the focused, assessing expression of someone, calculating what it would take to fix it rather than the distress of someone contemplating what had just happened to them. "The corner post rotted through," she said. "I see that," Alfred said. "I should have replaced it in the spring." "Hard to see everything that needs doing all at once," he said. He looked at her arm. "You need to wash that cut. It's just a scratch." "Scratches go bad without washing," he said, in the calm, matter-of-fact way he said most things, and she looked at him for a moment and then nodded and led him out of the wreckage to the pump by her kitchen door, where she worked the handle and held her arm under the water. Alfred looked at the fallen structure. "I can fix this," he said. "I need a new corner post and probably 3 new rails, and the roof will need reseating, but the frame looks sound on the other 3 sides." "Mr. Hayes," she began. "It's not charity," he said, because he had thought about this kind of moment, had thought about what it would look like and what she would need it not to look like. "You're my neighbor. Your hen house fell down on my side of the fence line. It's the kind of thing neighbors do." She dried her arm on the rough cloth that hung by the pump and looked at him steadily. "People will talk," she said. "People will talk no matter what," he said. "I've noticed that about this town." Something moved in her face, quick and small, something that might have been the beginning of a smile, and it transformed her features entirely for the half-second it lasted before she smoothed it down. "I'll repay you," she said. "I can give you eggs. And I put up preserves last week, the good peach ones." "That sounds fair," he said. He spent 2 days fixing her hen house, working in the early morning before the heat became punishing, and then in the evenings, and she brought him water during the heat of the day without making a ceremony of it, just setting a bucket and ladle near where he was working with the same practical simplicity with which she did everything. On the second evening, when he was finishing the roof, and the light was going gold and low in the west, she came out of the kitchen with a tin plate of biscuits and a jar of the promised peach preserves, and set them on the fence post and said, "You must be hungry." He climbed down from the roof and sat on an upturned crate and ate the biscuits, and they were the best biscuits he had eaten in years, light and warm with that particular quality that good biscuits have when they've been made by someone who actually knows what they're doing. He said so, and she looked briefly startled, as though compliments were items she had learned to greet with suspicion. "My mother taught me," she said. "She was a very good cook." "Where is she now?" he asked. "She died when I was 19, Lenora said, 4 years before my father." "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it in the unadorned, direct way that he meant most things he said. She sat down on the other upturned crate which she'd been using as a step stool while she worked nearby, and they were quiet for a moment in the way that two people can be quiet when the silence doesn't need to be filled, and the light went slowly from gold to rose and the first crickets started in the grass. "Why did you really do this?" she asked. Not accusatory, just direct. Directness seemed to be something else she had. "I told you, you're my neighbor." "People don't do things like this here," she said. "Not for me." He looked at her and considered his words with the care he gave to most of them. "I've been listening to what people say about you in town," he said, "and I'll tell you plainly that I don't believe it. Not because I know you well enough to be certain, but because I know the kind of man who says those kinds of things about a woman, and I know how those stories get built, and I know what the truth usually looks like underneath them." She was absolutely still for a moment. "None of it is true," she said, and her voice was perfectly even, and he could hear the enormous effort that evenness required. "I know that," he said. "You can't know that," she said. "You've only spoken to me a handful of times." "No," he said, "but I'm a fair judge of people, Miss Crawford, and I've been watching how you carry yourself for 6 weeks, and what I see is a woman who works hard and pays her debts and holds her head up and doesn't ask for anything she hasn't earned. That's not what a woman of poor character looks like. That's what a woman who's been wronged looks like." She looked away then, out toward the hills, and he saw her jaw tighten and then release, and he understood that what he'd said had cost her something to receive, that she had been living so long without anyone simply acknowledging the basic truth of her situation that the acknowledgement itself was almost painful. "Thank you," she said, very quietly. "It's just the truth," he said. He finished the hen house the next morning and collected his tools and went back to his own work, and the following Sunday he was surprised to find a fresh apple pie on his fence post with a note written in careful script that said, "For the work, L.C." He stood and looked at the pie for a moment, and felt something settle in his chest like a stone, finding its right place at the bottom of a creek. September came, and with it the first edges of fall, the air in the mornings cooling enough to be pleasant, the cedar trees beginning to release their particular dusty fragrance that was one of the things Alfred had already come to love about this part of the country. He had his barn complete now, and the foundation of his house dug, and the first courses of stone laid, and the work was going well enough that he permitted himself to think about the winter with some confidence that he would not be entirely without shelter when it came. He and Lenora had settled into a pattern of neighborliness that was comfortable in the way that right things tend to be comfortable, without pressure or pretense. He called out a greeting when he saw her in the yard, and she called back. Sometimes in the evenings they would end up on their respective sides of the fence at roughly the same hour, both having finished the day's work, and they would talk across it in the unhurried way of people who had found each other easy to talk to. He told her about the cattle drive years and the carpentry he'd learned and the town in Oklahoma where he'd grown up, and she told him about her father's farm and the way the debt had accumulated, quietly and then suddenly, and how she had decided after he died to stay and pay it rather than sell and leave. "You could have started somewhere else," he said once. "Somewhere where nobody knew your name." "Yes," she said. "I thought about that, but running would have meant they were right. It would have meant I believed what they said about me." She paused. "I didn't believe it, so I stayed." He thought about that for a long time afterward. About the particular kind of courage it required to stay inside a story that was burning you when leaving would have put the fire out. The first real test came in early September, when Thomas Eldridge himself rode out to Alfred's property. Alfred was working on the house walls when he heard the horse, and turned to see Thomas Eldridge dismounting by the fence. And he knew immediately who this was because the description he'd pieced together from conversations in Redrock fit the man exactly. Young and well-dressed, and wearing his own confidence like a garment that had been made for him before he'd done anything to deserve it. Thomas walked over with his hand out, and Alfred shook it because he was a fair man and because he did not make final judgments on first meetings. "Alfred Hayes," Thomas said. "Welcome to Redrock. I'm Tom Eldridge, My father owns the double E biggest spread in the county. I've heard of it, Alfred said. Thomas looked around the property with the appraising eye of a man accustomed to assessing what things were worth. You're building something solid here, he said. Good location. One piece of advice, neighbor to neighbor. Alfred waited. The woman on the parcel next to yours, Thomas said. Lenora Crawford, you'll want to keep your distance. She's got a reputation in this county that's, well, let's say you don't want to be associated with her trouble. Alfred set down the stone he was holding and turned to look at Thomas Eldridge fully, and he let the silence sit between them for a moment. I've heard about her reputation, Alfred said. Then I know that you started it, Alfred said. And I know why, and I know what kind of man does that to a woman. Thomas Eldridge's face went through several expressions in rapid succession, surprise and then anger and then something more calculating. I don't know what she's told you. She hasn't told me anything about you, Alfred said. I put it together myself from what people around town say and don't say and from watching how the thing operates. She didn't invite you to talk about her the way you've been talking about her. You know that as well as I do. Thomas took a step back, and his expression settled into the cold smoothness of a man who has been challenged before and knows how to manage it. You're new here, he said. You don't understand how things work. I understand well enough, Alfred said. And I'll tell you plain, Mr. Eldridge, that I intend to be a good neighbor to Lenora Crawford, and if you or anyone connected to you attempts to make that more difficult than it needs to be, I will not be pleasant about my response. Thomas Eldridge rode away without another word, and Alfred picked up his stone and went back to work. That evening he told Lenora about it, simply and directly, because he thought she deserved to know. She listened without speaking, her hands quiet in her lap for once, and when he was finished she said, "He won't let it go." "No," Alfred said, "probably not. Men like that don't enjoy being told plainly what they are." "You shouldn't have come here," she said, and she said it with a kind of exhausted kindness, as though she were trying to protect something that she wasn't sure could be protected. "You'll only get tangled in it." "I'm already tangled in it," he said. "I've been tangled in it since the first morning I heard his cousin Roy talking about you in the saloon and felt my blood go cold." He looked at her. "I'm not looking to untangle myself." She looked at him for a long moment in the fading light, and he saw something in her face that was new, something that was not quite the careful composure she usually wore, something softer and more uncertain, and it made her look younger and also more herself somehow, as though the composure was the practiced thing and this was what lived underneath it. "Why?" she asked. The simplest question. The hardest one. He thought about his answer carefully because she deserved a careful answer and not an impulsive one. "Because the brand is wrong," he said. "That's all. What they've put on you is wrong, and I can see that it's wrong. And a man who can see a wrong and looks the other way because it's convenient isn't the kind of man I want to be." She nodded slowly, and then she stood and said good night and went inside, and Alfred rode home to his tent beside the unfinished house walls and lay on his cot looking at the stars through the canvas, and felt the particular ache of someone who has understood something about themselves that they hadn't quite articulated before. He was falling in love with her. He had been falling in love with her, he thought, since that first morning in Harlan's store, when she'd walked past him with her basket and her straight back and her chin at exactly the angle it needed to be. And he hadn't known then what it was because it had felt like recognition rather than attraction, like seeing something familiar in a place you'd never been. He did not press it. He understood that pressing it would be wrong, that she had learned to be wary of men who moved toward her with purposes she couldn't read, and that what he was building between them had to be built the same slow way he was building his house, stone by stone, with the patient knowledge that what was solid took time. October arrived and the weather turned properly cool, and Alfred finished the walls of his house and began working on the roof, and the cattle herd grew by 12 head from a purchase he made from a rancher passing through on his way west. And the work of establishing himself in the land was satisfying in a deep and fundamental way. He bought a second milk cow and he began putting up winter hay, and he fixed the creek bridge on his south property line that had been rotted through before he arrived. Lenora came to his fence line one afternoon in mid-October with a jar of honey and a look on her face that he recognized as the look of someone who had been working up to saying something. "The widow Pruitt came to see me this morning," she said. He knew who Martha Pruitt was, a gray-haired woman who ran the small boarding house on Cedar Street with quiet efficiency, and who was one of the few women in Redrock who had not entirely withdrawn her civility from Lenora, though she hadn't exactly extended it either. "What did she want?" he asked. "She came to warn me," Lenora said. "She said Thomas Eldridge has been telling people that you and I are that we're already—" She stopped and her jaw was tight. "That it's already what he claimed before." Alfred set down his tools. "I see. She said people are saying that's why you defended me, that you're just another man taking advantage." She said it steadily, but he could see what it cost her, could see the specific exhaustion of a person who had been slandered so many times that a new slander was not a shock, but simply an additional weight added to a load already at the limit of what could be carried. "And what do you think?" he asked. She looked at him directly. "I think you're not that kind of man," she said, "but what I think doesn't change what they're saying." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." He was quiet for a moment. "Does it bother you, what they're saying about us?" She considered this honestly. "It bothers me that they're saying it," she said. "It doesn't bother me that there's an us to say it about." He felt the words land somewhere inside him with the quiet force of something important. He looked at her and she looked back at him, and the October wind moved through the cedars and carried the smell of dry grass and wood smoke. "Lenora," he said, and it was the first time he had used her Christian name, and he saw her register it. "Would you do me the honor of having supper with me on Sunday? I have a fire ring set up by the house foundation, and I've been meaning to cook a proper meal, and I think it would do us both good to sit down to one." Something that was absolutely and unmistakably a smile crossed her face, and it was the first full smile he had seen from her, unguarded and real, and it did something significant to his ability to think clearly. "Yes," she said, "I believe I would like that." The Sunday supper was the first of many. He made a venison stew that had been his mother's recipe, with dried herbs from Harlan's store and potatoes from his own garden, and she brought cornbread and a pot of late-season apple butter, and they sat across from each other at the rough table he'd made from fenced timber and talked from sundown until the stars were fully established overhead. He learned that she had read everything she could get her hands on since childhood, that she had memorized long sections of Jane Austen and Walter Scott, and had opinions about both that were precise and amusing and entirely her own. He told her about the way the cattle drives had looked at night, the great black shapes of the herd moving in the dark with only the sounds of them, and the smell to tell you the scale of what you were in the middle of. She told him, carefully and in pieces, what had actually happened with Thomas Eldridge, the kiss behind the church and her rejection of him, and the weeks of retaliation that followed. And as she told it, Alfred listened without interrupting, and without performing the outrage he felt because he thought she had had enough of other people's performances, and what she needed was someone to simply receive the truth. When she was done, he said, "Thank you for telling me." "You're the only person I've told," she said, "outside of the Reverend and the sheriff." "Did neither of them help you?" "No," she said simply. He thought about that and about what it meant, about the particular kind of injustice that operated in small places where the powerful could define reality, and the powerless could either accept the definition or be worn down by the refusal of it. He thought about Lenora spending 2 years inside that injustice with nothing but her own stubborn dignity for armor, and he felt something that was both tenderness and a clean, uncomplicated anger. "The brand is wrong," he said again, because it was the right thing to say and he wanted her to hear it a second time. "Everything they've said about you is wrong and false and built by a man who couldn't manage being told no, and everyone in this county who repeated it or added to it is complicit in a cruelty that they should be ashamed of." She was looking at him across the fire, and her eyes were bright in the firelight, and he thought she was the most remarkable woman he had ever sat across from. "You said that once before," she said. "I meant it both times," he said. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, briefly, a touch that was there and then gone like a bird landing and lifting. And then she picked up her coffee cup and said something about the apple butter, and the conversation moved on. But Alfred Hayes sat with the memory of that touch like a man holding something fragile and precious that had been given into his keeping. November brought the first cold snaps, and Alfred completed his roof and got glass into his windows, and moved his belongings from Josiah Pruitt's loft into his own house for the first night. And he sat by his new fireplace and thought this was what permanence felt like, and was glad of it. He was more glad of it than he'd expected to be, and he thought that some part of that gladness was because the permanence now had something specific attached to it, a shape and direction it hadn't had when he'd first arrived in Redrock. The trouble with Thomas Eldridge became concrete in the second week of November. Alfred came back from a supply run to find that the fence between his property and Lenora's had been torn down on the stretch nearest the road, the posts pulled, and the rails thrown aside, and that 3 of Lenora's goats had wandered through the gap and were currently spread across his pasture. Clement and the other horses were unsettled and crowded into the far corner of the corral. He went to Lenora's house and knocked, and she came to the door with her shawl pulled around her and looked past him to the gap. Her face went still in a particular way. "I'll get the goats," he said. "That fence was fine yesterday," she said. "I know." He looked at her. "Do you have any trouble with anyone else, or is this Eldridge business specifically?" "It's been specifically," she said quietly. "Since we started talking. Small things, a gate left open, a pile of wood I'd stacked for winter knocked over, nothing I could prove." Alfred gathered the goats, which took some patient work, and got them back through the gap, and then spent the rest of the afternoon repairing the fence, working steadily and without particular comment, and when he was done the fence was stronger than it had been before. He went to the door again and knocked. "It's fixed," he said. She looked at him in the door of her small house with the firelight behind her making the edges of her hair warm, and she said, "Alfred, you should be careful." It was the first time she had used his given name, and they both heard it, and neither of them remarked on it, but something shifted perceptibly between them. "I'm not much worried about Thomas Eldridge," he said. "He has power here," she said. His father's influence is not my concern," Alfred said. "What's my concern is you, and the fact that you've been dealing with this alone when you shouldn't have had to deal with it at all." She looked at him for a long, searching moment, and then she said, "Would you like to come in? I have coffee on." He went in. It was the first time he had been inside her house, and it was exactly as he would have imagined it if he'd tried, spare and orderly, and inhabited with the evidence of a person who had made peace with what she had: a braided rug on the floor, books stacked on the windowsill, a good iron stove with a pot of something fragrant on it, embroidered curtains that were worn but carefully mended. They sat at her kitchen table with their coffee and talked until the fire needed banking, and when he got up to leave, she walked him to the door, and they stood for a moment in the doorway with the cold November air coming in around the edges, and the stars very clear and sharp overhead. "Lenora," he said. "Yes, I want to say something, and I want to say it plainly, because I think you've had enough of men who say things around the edges, and you deserve someone who says the thing itself." He paused and looked at her directly. "I am in love with you. I have been for some time. I'm not asking you to do anything with that information tonight. I just wanted you to know it clearly, without any confusion about what I mean." She looked at him for a long time, and the stars were brilliant behind her, and the cold air smelled of cedar and frost, and when she spoke her voice was very quiet and very steady. "I know," she said. "I've known for a while, and I think—" She stopped and then started again. "I think I feel the same way, and that frightens me considerably." "Why?" he asked, though he knew. Because I trusted my judgment before and I was wrong about what the world would do with it, she said. You weren't wrong about your judgment, he said. You were wronged by someone who didn't deserve your trust and then by every person who repeated what he said about you. That's not the same thing as your judgment being wrong. He held her gaze. I would like to spend a long time being the kind of man who proves that distinction to you. She reached out and took his hand in both of hers, her fingers cold from the night air, and held it for a long moment. And then she said good night, and he walked to where Clement was tied and rode home through the cold and the dark with his heart in a state he hadn't felt since he was very young, open and unguarded and fully committed to the direction it was going. December arrived with a hard freeze that locked the ground and silvered the cedars, and made the morning so cold that breath came out in great white clouds. Alfred built up his herd and tended his animals and worked on the interior of his house, laying proper floorboards and building a second fireplace in the bedroom. He and Lenora saw each other nearly every day now, the pretense of pure neighborliness quietly set aside without either of them having to formally put it aside, replaced by something that was simply and straightforwardly what it was. He went to her house for supper twice a week. She came to his to see the progress he was making on the floors and to offer opinions about where the kitchen shelves should be built, opinions he solicited honestly because she had more practical domestic sense than he did. They rode together one Sunday afternoon to the top of the hill on the eastern edge of his property, where you could see 30 miles in every direction on a clear day, and she looked out at the country spread below them in its winter gold and gray and said, "It's very beautiful," with a simple conviction that made him glad he'd brought her here. Thomas Eldridge made his final move in the last week of December. He came to Alfred's property with his father, Warren Eldridge, a big, gray-haired man who carried his wealth and authority like a physical thing, thick and unapologetic. They came in a good carriage with a matched pair of horses, and they came at mid-morning on a weekday when they presumably calculated Alfred would be working alone and could be approached as the solitary newcomer who could be reminded of his precariousness. Alfred saw them coming and set down what he was doing and stood in front of his partially finished house and waited. Warren Eldridge got down from the carriage with the deliberateness of a man who was accustomed to every room adjusting itself to his arrival. "Hayes," he said, "we're here to have a sensible conversation." "I'm listening," Alfred said. "My son tells me you've been spending considerable time with the Crawford woman," Warren said. "Now, I'm going to be plain with you, because I think plain talk is the right approach between men. I know you're new here and I know you may not understand the full situation. Lenora Crawford's reputation in this county is—" "Warren," Alfred said, and he used the man's given name with the flatness of someone who was not impressed. "I know exactly what Lenora Crawford's reputation in this county is. I know who built it and why. And with respect, I have absolutely no interest in your opinion of her or in any conversation that treats that reputation as a settled fact." Warren Eldridge looked at him with the genuine surprise of a man who was rarely spoken to this way. Thomas, behind him, had gone rigid. "You're making a significant mistake," Warren said. "I don't think so," Alfred said. "I think the significant mistake here was made by your son 2 years ago when he decided to punish a woman for not wanting him by destroying her character with lies. And I think the continuation of that mistake is every person in this county who has compounded those lies for 2 years without stopping to question whether they were true." He looked from Warren to Thomas and back. "Now, I've bought land here and I intend to stay, and I intend to continue keeping company with Lenora Crawford, and if your family attempts to interfere with either of those facts, I will take what I have seen and heard in this county to the Redrock Courier, and I will make sure every detail of how this situation started and who is responsible for it is put into print for every person in this territory to read." There was a silence. "That's a threat," Thomas said. "It's a statement of intent," Alfred said. "There's a difference. Threats come from weakness. I'm not feeling particularly weak." Warren Eldridge looked at Alfred Hayes for a long time with the assessing gaze of a man who was genuinely trying to calculate the situation he was in, and Alfred looked back at him steadily, and the winter wind moved through the cedars, and somewhere on the property Clement stamped and blew. "You'd better know what you're getting yourself into," Warren said finally, but the authority had gone out of his voice, and what remained was more like a warning than a command. "I know exactly what I'm getting myself into," Alfred said. "Good day, Mr. Eldridge." They left, and Alfred stood in front of his unfinished house and watched them go, and then he went to Lenora's property and told her what had happened, completely and without softening any of it, because she deserved to know the full truth of what was being said and decided about her life. She listened with her hands clasped in her lap and her face very still. "He won't print a retraction," she said when he described the threat about the newspaper. "Delbert Price is in Warren Eldridge's pocket. He turned away my letter 2 years ago. I have a different approach in mind," Alfred said. "Price might not print anything against the Eldridges, but the county seat has a paper. And the territorial paper out of Austin has been running stories about exactly this kind of thing, social abuses in small towns, the way power gets used to silence people who ought to have recourse." He looked at her. "I think if you were willing to tell your story publicly, someone would print it." She looked at him for a long time. "That's a frightening thing to consider," she said. "Yes," he said. "I know. People would read it everywhere." "Yes," he said again. "And some of them would believe it and some of them wouldn't, and the Eldridges would be furious, but it would be on record. The truth would be on record. That matters, even when it doesn't fix everything." "You really believe that?" she said. It was not a question exactly. "I really do," he said. She was quiet for a long time, looking at her hands. Outside the kitchen window the winter light was thin and pale and the cedars were absolutely still. "Let me think on it," she said. "Take all the time you need," he said. On the last day of the year 1883, Alfred Hayes asked Lenora Crawford to marry him. He did it in the most straightforward way he could think of, which was to bring her to the top of the hill on his property where they'd stood before and look out at the country below and turn to her and say what he meant. "I love you," he said. "I know you've had more than enough reason to distrust what men say and what men intend, and I know that marrying me would put you in the middle of a fight with the Eldridges that isn't finished yet. And I know that 2 years of being told you're not worth respect doesn't vanish because one man says differently. But I am asking you to marry me, Lenora, because you are the most extraordinary person I have ever had the privilege of knowing, and because I want to spend the rest of my life being the kind of man who deserves to stand beside you, and because I think we would build something remarkable together." She looked at him for what felt like a very long time, and the wind was still and the winter sky was the specific clear pale blue of cold days in the Texas hills, and her eyes were the color of the cedar trees when the light hits them at the right angle. "I want to tell you something first," she said. "Tell me." "I am going to write the letter," she said. "I decided last night. I'm going to write to the Austin paper and tell them everything. Everything Thomas Eldridge did and everything the county did after him, and I'm going to sign my name to it. And I'm going to do it regardless of whether you and regardless of anything. Because you're right that the truth should be on record, and because I've been carrying that silence for 2 years and it's time I put it down." She looked at him steadily. "I wanted you to know that before I answer you, because I need you to know that whatever I decide has nothing to do with needing protection from the Eldridges. That's not why I would say yes." "I know that," he said. "Do you?" "I know that," he said again with certainty. She looked at him one more time with those steady, serious eyes, and then something happened in her face, a gentleness, a yielding that was not weakness but its precise opposite, the yielding of someone strong enough to choose vulnerability because they have determined it is worth it. "Yes," she said. "Alfred Hayes, yes." He took her hands and held them, and the year turned over around them and the hills of Redrock County lay below them in their winter silver, and he thought that this was the most important thing that had ever happened to him, and he wanted to be exactly equal to the weight of it. They told no one immediately. It was enough, for those first days of January 1884, for just the two of them to know, to be certain of each other without the town's opinion arranging itself around the fact of it. Lenora wrote her letter. She sat at her kitchen table over 4 evenings and wrote it in the careful, precise script she used for everything. And it was long and factual and named names, and gave dates, and described with devastating accuracy the sequence of events that had followed Thomas Eldridge's lie, the spreading of it, the addition of other men's embellishments, the Reverend's ineffectual sympathy and the sheriff's shrug, and the newspaper editor who had thrown away her written account without reading it. When she was done, she read it aloud to Alfred, who sat across the table from her and listened from beginning to end without speaking. When she finished, he said, "It's very good, it's exactly right." "I'm frightened," she said. "I know," he said. "You're still sending it." She almost smiled. "Yes," she said, "I am." She sent it to the Austin Daily Statesman, addressed to the editor in the second week of January. The response came faster than either of them expected. In the third week of January, a man named Cornelius Webb arrived in Redrock on the stage from Austin, a slight, sharp-eyed man of perhaps 40, who introduced himself as a staff writer for the Statesman, and who had come to follow up on the letter he'd received from a Miss Lenora Crawford of Redrock County. He came to her farm and she spoke with him for 2 hours, and Alfred was present because she asked him to be, not for protection but for witness. Webb was a careful journalist, the kind who asked the same question 3 different ways to make sure he had the real answer, and he was respectful and thorough, and not unkind. He went into town afterward and interviewed several people, and apparently attempted to speak with Thomas Eldridge, who declined, and Warren Eldridge, who told him that the Statesman had no business in Redrock County, which was probably the worst thing Warren could have said to a journalist. The story appeared in the Austin Daily Statesman on the 14th of February, 1884. It was not a small story. It was the kind of story that the paper ran when it wanted to make a point about the treatment of women in frontier communities, and Cornelius Webb had written it with the precision of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. He had named Thomas Eldridge. He had described the pattern of intimidation. He had noted the Reverend's and the sheriff's failures to act. He had quoted Lenora's letter in significant sections, and had framed it as a case study in the kind of social cruelty that operated in small communities under the cover of reputation and respectability. It landed in Redrock like a stone into a very still pond. Franklin Harlan read it and looked different when Lenora came into his store the following Saturday, less of the careful charity in his manner, and more of something that was closer to simple respect. Martha Pruitt came to Lenora's door for the first time ever and sat in her kitchen for half an hour and said, "I should have spoken up 2 years ago and I didn't, and I'm sorry for that." Reverend Aldous wrote a letter to the Statesman, which they published, in which he acknowledged without quite apologizing that he had failed in his pastoral duty to a member of his congregation. Thomas Eldridge left Redrock in March. He went west, to California, or so the story went, and the going was not precisely voluntary, as Warren Eldridge apparently concluded that his son's continued presence was more liability than asset given the new state of things. Warren himself was quieter after the story appeared, not transformed into a decent man, but chastened enough to cease his active obstruction. Sheriff Boone stopped Alfred on the street one afternoon in February and said, with the pained expression of a man making an admission he'd been sitting with for a while, "I should have listened better when she came to me. I know that." "You should tell her that," Alfred said. He did. It did not fix everything, and Alfred and Lenora both understood that it would not. The brand that had been pressed into Lenora's character over 2 years could not be entirely removed by one newspaper story, and there would always be people in Redrock County who would carry the old version of her in their heads, because it was the version they'd always held, and changing it required an effort they were not inclined to make. But the balance of the thing shifted, and that mattered, and Lenora felt the shift in the way she walked through Redrock, the small but real difference between tolerating a world that had closed against her and moving through one that was cautiously, imperfectly, beginning to open. They were married on a Saturday in early April of 1884, in a ceremony performed by Reverend Aldous at the Presbyterian Church, which was perhaps a gesture of reconciliation on Lenora's part, and which Alfred honored by not expressing the considerable doubt he had about the Reverend's deserts. Martha Pruitt stood with Lenora as her witness. Josiah Pruitt, the taciturn livery owner who had turned out to be a genuinely decent man, stood with Alfred. The church was not full, but it was fuller than Lenora had expected, and some of the faces that looked up at her as she walked down the short aisle were faces she recognized as having looked at her differently once, and she thought that the looking differently now was imperfect and incomplete and real, and she would accept the real part and not ask more of it than was there. Alfred was waiting at the front of the church in his best clothes, which were not particularly fine but which he had clearly pressed with care, and when she reached him, he was looking at her with that direct, warm, serious look that she had come to understand was the most genuine thing about him, the look that said exactly what it meant without any performance attached to it, and she felt the last of the armor she'd been wearing for 2 years simply fall away, quietly, without ceremony. As though it had been waiting for exactly this moment to recognize it was no longer needed. The Reverend said the words, and they said their words, and Alfred put a plain gold ring on her finger that he had ordered from a jeweler in San Antonio. And when the Reverend pronounced them, married Alfred took her face in his hands and kissed her with a tenderness that made Martha Pruitt press her handkerchief to her eyes. They went home to Alfred's house, which was properly finished now, with good wooden floors and real glass in all the windows, and a bedroom with a fireplace, and a kitchen large enough for 2 people to work in. Lenora had already moved most of her things the week before, had hung her embroidered curtains in the kitchen, and lined her books along the window shelf in the parlor, and the house had already begun to feel like the accumulation of 2 lives rather than one. She had kept her farm. It was a decision they had made together, practically and practically. The Crawford parcel would serve as additional grazing land for the growing cattle herd, and give them space for a larger vegetable operation than either of them could manage alone, and the title to it remained in Lenora's name. A fact that Alfred had insisted upon, and which Lenora had accepted after he explained that he insisted upon it not because of sentiment, but because a woman whose property had been her independence and her dignity for 2 years ought to keep her name on it. That first spring of their marriage was a revelation to Alfred in ways he had not anticipated. He had known he loved her, had known it with the certainty that he brought to all his important conclusions, but living alongside her changed the shape of what he knew. He discovered that she was genuinely funny, that her sense of humor was dry and precise, and surfaced in unexpected moments, that she had observations about people and situations that could make him laugh until he had to set down whatever he was holding. He discovered that she was an insomniac in the way of people who think too much, and that the way she managed it was to come downstairs in the early hours and read by the firelight, and that she was not distressed by this condition, but had simply made peace with it the way she made peace with most things about herself. He discovered that she was fearless on horseback, that she rode with the ease of someone who had grown up in the saddle, and who communicated with a horse through something that was almost conversation. She discovered about him, she told him one evening with that dry humor, that he talked to his tools when the work was giving him trouble, a running, quiet commentary of reasoning and mild reproach that she had overheard from the yard, and which she found more endearing than she was willing to fully admit. She discovered that he had a singing voice, a low, carrying baritone that he used when he was working and unaware of being heard, and that he seemed to know an enormous repertoire of hymns and old Scottish ballads and trail songs, which he rendered without distinction as to the appropriate occasion for each. She discovered that he was patient to a degree that she had never encountered in a man before, patient with animals and with difficult situations, and with her own moments of lingering weariness, which surfaced sometimes without her meaning them to. When a man's voice was raised in a certain way nearby, or when someone looked at her with a certain kind of assessment. And in those moments, he simply stayed where he was without requiring her to explain herself. Through the spring they built the cattle herd to 60 head, a proper start toward the ranching operation Alfred had in mind. And they planted the largest kitchen garden Lenora had ever managed, stretching across 2 acres of the good bottom land by the creek, with corn and tomatoes and beans and squash, and a long row of the sunflowers she grew because they made her happy. She expanded her egg operation, adding 20 more hens to the existing flock, and she sold eggs to Harlan's store and to 3 families in town who had begun, tentatively, to see her as simply a woman who had eggs to sell rather than as the figure of reproach the county had constructed. In May, Franklin Harlan offered her a standing contract for eggs and preserved goods, and she shook his hand in his store and he looked her in the eye and said, "You run a good operation, Mrs. Hayes." And it was the first time since her father's death that anyone in town had acknowledged what she did with a straightforward professional respect. "Thank you, Mr. Harlan," she said, and she meant it, and she didn't need to hold her chin at quite the same angle when she walked out the door. By summer she knew she was expecting a baby. She told Alfred on a June evening when they were sitting on the porch of the house watching the last light leave the western hills, told him the way she told him most things, directly and without elaborate preamble, and she watched his face go through the specific journey of a man receiving news of tremendous importance, surprise and then a joy so uncomplicated and full that it went past the ordinary demonstrations of happiness into something quieter and more profound. He put his arm around her and she leaned against him and they sat like that for a long time while the stars came out one at a time, and he said finally into her hair, "A baby. Lenora, we're going to have a baby." "We are," she said. "Are you well?" he asked, immediately practical. "Have you been feeling all right?" "I've been feeling tired and a little sick in the mornings," she said. "But yes, I think I'm quite well." "We'll get the doctor out from town," he said. "Alfred, women have been having babies in this country without. We'll get the doctor out from town," he said again, in the same tone, and she looked up at him, and the expression on his face was so completely tender and completely decided at once that she laughed, which she had not expected. "Very well," she said. "Doctor." Paul Morrow, who had arrived in Redrock the previous fall, and who was a young man of genuine competence and the admirable trait of treating his patients without reference to their social standing, came out and confirmed what Lenora already knew, and estimated that the baby would arrive in February of 1885, and prescribed rest and good food, and the avoidance of heavy lifting, most of which Lenora observed, and some of which she observed more loosely when Alfred wasn't watching. The pregnancy was, on the whole, not difficult. She was healthy and strong, and she continued to manage the household and the garden and the egg operation with only minor adjustments to what she lifted and carried. And Alfred watched her with a vigilance she found both touching and occasionally excessive, and told him so, and he received this information with good humor, and persisted in the vigilance regardless. The county changed around them through that year in small ways that accumulated into something meaningful. The newspaper story had done its work slowly, the way most true things work, not in a dramatic reversal but in a gradual erosion of the old story's authority, so that by the summer of 1884 the people of Redrock who had once repeated Thomas Eldridge's account of Lenora Crawford as settled fact found themselves less certain of it, found themselves revising what they told newcomers, found themselves looking at the actual woman who existed in front of them and doing the work of recalibrating. Martha Pruitt became a genuine friend, coming out to the Hayes farm 2 or 3 times a month, and bringing gossip and practical wisdom, and the kind of company that Lenora, who had been so alone for so long, received with something that took her a while to identify as simple gratitude for ordinary friendship. Reverend Aldous, whose relationship with Lenora remained somewhat complicated by the history between them, nonetheless proved himself useful by delivering a sermon in August on the subject of bearing false witness that was so pointed in its application that half the congregation was unable to look at the pew where the Hayes family sat without considerable discomfort. The man at the blacksmith's shop, a big quiet Cherokee man named Jonas Birdsong, who had been running his forge on the south end of Cedar Street for 6 years, and who had always treated Lenora with the simple courtesy of someone who formed his own opinions, began to include her in the kind of easy conversation he had with regular customers, which was his particular form of acceptance and which she valued accordingly. In September, Warren Eldridge came to Alfred's property alone, without his carriage, riding his own horse, and asked to speak with him. Alfred invited him to sit on the porch and brought him coffee, which was a courtesy he was not obliged to extend, and which he extended anyway because he was not interested in performing grudges. Warren sat with his coffee and was quiet for a moment and then said, "I didn't know the full extent of what Thomas did. I want you to know that. I knew he was saying things and I let it go because," he stopped, "because he was my son, and what he was saying was convenient for keeping the county's opinion organized in a way that suited my interests. I knew it was wrong and I allowed it." He looked at Alfred with the expression of a man who was saying something he has been working up to and does not particularly enjoy but has decided is necessary. "I would like to make a formal apology to your wife if she would receive it." Alfred looked at him for a moment. "That would be her decision," he said. "Would you ask her?" He went inside and told Lenora, and she stood in the kitchen with her hands on the back of the chair and was quiet for a moment, and then she went out to the porch. What passed between Lenora and Warren Eldridge on that porch Alfred did not hear in detail, because he went inside and gave them the space of it. When she came back and she looked tired but also cleaner somehow, as though something that had been pressing on her had moved. "He apologized," she said. "He meant it, I think, or at least some of it." "Are you all right?" Alfred asked. "Yes," she said. "I'm actually quite all right. The winter of 1884 to 1885 was cold and good, the house warm and the cattle settled in their winter pasture and the pantry full of the summer's preserving work. Alfred built a cradle in December, working on it in the evenings by the parlor fire while Lenora sat across from him reading or mending, and the sound of his tools on the wood was a particular kind of domesticity that she had not known she wanted until she found herself inside it. He showed her the finished cradle on Christmas morning, having moved it in from the barn where he'd been working on it, and she ran her hands over the smooth cedar wood and the carved edge he'd put along the headboard, a simple vine pattern that he'd worked out slowly over several evenings, and she looked at him, and he saw that she was close to tears, which was an unusual event. "It's beautiful," she said. "It's good cedar," he said. "It'll last." "Alfred." "Yes. I love you," she said. "I need you to know that I love you in a way I was not certain for a long time that I was capable of, because I had put so much of myself into simply surviving that I thought the rest of it might be gone. But it isn't. You found it. I don't know entirely how, but you found it." He crossed the parlor and put his arms around her carefully, mindful of the considerable evidence of the baby between them, and she rested her head against his chest, and he held her in the warm room with the fire going and the winter silence outside, and he thought that if this was what the rest of his life looked like, he was the most fortunate man in Texas. The baby arrived on the 17th of February, 1885, in the middle of a cold night with Dr. Morrow present and Martha Pruitt serving as the capable domestic anchor of the situation. And it was a boy, a healthy, remarkably loud boy with Alfred's dark hair and Lenora's straight nose. And Alfred sat by the bed when it was over and held his wife's hand and looked at his son with an expression that Lenora thought was the most openly unguarded thing she had ever seen on his face. They named him William James Hayes, for Alfred's father and Lenora's, and they called him Will from the first hour, and will prove to be from the beginning a child of enormous opinion and considerable energy, who took up whatever room he was in with the full authority of a person who had no reason to believe the world was not arranged for his benefit. The spring of 1885 was the first spring in which Lenora's life looked the way she thought lives were supposed to look, full and useful, and anchored to people and land and work that meant something. She was 28 years old, and she had a husband and a son, and a farm and 60 head of cattle, and an egg contract with Harlan's store and a friend in Martha Pruitt, and a standing argument with Alfred about whether the south fence line needed replacing before the north one, which was a perfectly ordinary marital argument that she enjoyed having. She went into Redrock on a Tuesday in May with Will in the basket on the wagon seat beside her, and she walked into Harlan's store, and every conversation did not stop. Some people looked. Some people greeted her. Franklin Harlan said, "Morning, Mrs. Hayes," and she said, "Morning, Mr. Harlan," and she gave him her order and he filled it, and they spoke briefly about the egg prices and about whether the summer was going to be dry, and she walked out of the store into the May sunshine with her son and her basket and her chin at whatever angle seemed appropriate, which was level, the same as always. But the effort of keeping it level was so much less than it had once been that she noticed the difference the way you notice when a weight you've been carrying for a very long time is suddenly gone. She stood on the boardwalk outside Harlan's for a moment in the warm spring light and looked at the town of Redrock, at the familiar buildings and the familiar street and the familiar faces moving in and out of the familiar establishments, and she thought about the woman who had walked this same street for 2 years bearing a brand that was not hers, that had never been hers, that had been pressed onto her by someone who had no right to mark her. Alfred had said the brand was wrong. He had said it, and he had meant it, and he had proven it with every day that followed the saying, with every stone he'd laid, and every fence he'd mended, and every conversation he'd refused to avoid, and every morning he'd woken beside her, and every evening he'd sat across from her, and every moment in between. She walked back to her wagon and settled Will, who was beginning to express opinions about being in a basket in the sunshine, and she drove home through the spring morning on the road that went east out of Redrock toward the hill country properties, past the cedars and the live oaks coming into their new growth, past the creek that ran clean and clear after the winter rains, past the good solid fence line that ran between her land and Alfred's land, which was now the same land, which was now their land together. Alfred was at the fence when she came in on the wagon, working on a section of the new corral with the methodical competence that characterized everything he did, and he looked up when he heard the wagon and came to help her down, taking Will from the basket with the practiced ease of a man who had been doing it for 3 months and had learned the particular geometry of managing an infant. "Good trip," he said. "Yes," she said. "Harlan's giving us better terms on the egg contract. I negotiated it." He looked at her with the smile that was her favorite of his expressions, the one that was proud and warm and entirely without surprise. "Of course you did," he said. She took Will back from him, and Will grabbed a fist of her hair and held on with conviction, and Alfred put his arm around her, and they stood in the May morning with the cattle moving in the pasture and the garden coming up green and thick along the creek bottom and the house on the hill solid and permanent against the sky. "I want to plant more peaches," she said, "on the south slope. They do well there, and we can sell them in town." "How many trees?" he said. 20 to start," she said. "We'll see what takes. I'll order them from the nursery in San Antonio," he said. "If we plant in the fall, they'll be established before next summer." "Good," she said. She rested her head briefly against his shoulder, just for a moment, and felt the solid warmth of him and the weight of her son, and the sun on her face and the ground firm under her feet. "Good," she said again, quieter. Will decided he was finished with being held and indicated this preference loudly, and she laughed and went inside to feed him, and Alfred went back to the corral fence, and the sound of his hammer was regular and patient in the spring air. That summer, a family named Alderton arrived on the road from the east and bought the old Pickett farm 2 miles north of town, and they came to introduce themselves to their neighbors in the methodical way of sensible people getting their bearings in a new place. When they arrived at the Hayes farm, Miriam Alderton shook Lenora's hand and said, "We heard you were the ones to talk to about the best land for a kitchen garden." And Lenora thought, standing in her own yard with her own house behind her, and the garden visible in the creek bottom and the cattle moving in the pasture, that there was no sentence she could have imagined hearing 5 years ago that would have been more ordinary and more extraordinary than that one. "Come inside," she said. "I'll put coffee on and tell you everything I know." The years that followed were full ones. The cattle herd grew to 120 by 1887, and Alfred built a second barn and hired 2 hands to help manage the operation. Young men, named Davis and Cooper, who were reliable and worked well, and who addressed Lenora as Mrs. Hayes with the simple respect of employees who understand their situation clearly. She continued to expand the egg business and added the peach orchard, which flourished on the south slope exactly as she'd hoped, and by 1888 the Crawford Hayes farm, as people in town had taken to calling it, which pleased her in ways she chose not to examine too carefully, was one of the more productive small operations in the county. In the spring of 1887 their second child was born, a daughter they named Clara Rose, who arrived with Lenora's gray eyes and Alfred's unflappable temperament, and who proved from infancy to be the opposite of her brother in every particular: quiet where he was loud, deliberate where he was impulsive, content to observe the world from a position of comfortable certainty, where will was always testing its boundaries. Will was 3 years old when Clara was born, and he received the information that there was now a baby sister in the house, with the philosophical acceptance of someone who has made peace with the irreversible. And within 2 weeks, he was showing her things with the proprietary pride of a person sharing treasures, bringing her wooden animals from his box of toys and holding them up before her largely uncomprehending gaze with the declaration that this was a horse, and this was a cow, and this was a dog whose name was Biscuit. Alfred watched his children with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, and Lenora watched him watching them and thought about the particular fortune of having a father who was present in the full sense, not just physically located on the property, but genuinely there, curious about who they were and patient with the considerable work of finding out. In 1888 she wrote to the Austin Daily Statesman again, not about herself, but about the general situation of women's property rights in Texas, a subject she had been thinking about with increasing focus since the years of managing her father's debts alone, and Cornelius Webb, who had moved up to the position of senior writer by then, wrote back within a week saying he would be glad to publish it. And they did. And it was the beginning of a correspondence and an occasional column she would contribute to the paper for the next several years, under the name Lenora Hayes, which she had earned and which was hers. Alfred read every piece she wrote and gave her his honest opinion, which was always direct and sometimes critical in small ways and always specific, and she valued the criticism more than she might have valued only praise because she could trust that, when he said something was good, he meant it without reservation. They grew into the land together, into the seasons and the rhythms of the work, and the specific pleasures and difficulties of building something that was meant to last. There were hard years. The drought of 1886 was genuinely terrible, and they lost cattle and the garden failed in the summer months, and they drew on their savings in ways that required careful management. There were winters when the cold came hard and early, and the work of keeping animals alive through it was exhausting and unrelenting. There were ordinary difficulties, the kinds that accumulate in any life: animals that died, fences that failed at inopportune times, a neighbor dispute about water rights that required 3 months of negotiation to resolve, one significant argument between Alfred and Lenora about the management of the orchard income that lasted 3 days before they talked it through properly, and came out on the other side of it closer than before, which was something she had not known arguments could do. But the foundation was right, and what is built on a right foundation holds, and their life together held through all of it. Will Hayes, at 7 years old, was given his first small responsibility for the cattle herd, the morning count, which he performed with a seriousness of purpose that Alfred found admirable and Lenora found hilarious in the best way. Her son standing in the field in the early morning with his father's old hat on his head, considerably too large, making marks on a piece of paper with a stubby pencil. Clara Hayes at 5 could identify every plant in the kitchen garden by name, and had opinions about which ones were performing adequately and which needed more attention. She had also developed a relationship with the horses that was so intuitive that Jonah's birdsong, who had come out to the farm to look at one of the Hayes horses that needed its shoes done, watched her with the animals for a few minutes and said to Alfred, "That girl is going to be a horse person. The horses know it already." Alfred told Lenora this, and she said, "Of course they do," with the serene certainty of a woman who understood her daughter entirely. The Redrock of 1889 was not the Redrock of 1883. Nothing was ever entirely what it had been, and the passage of those 6 years had changed the town in ways large and small, some of the faces familiar, and some of the shops changed hands, and some of the old certainties shifted by the simple friction of time and events, and the way reality insists on complicating whatever simplified story a place tells about itself. Thomas Eldridge had not returned from California, and the word was that he was doing reasonably well there in the land business, which Lenora received with the equanimity of someone who had genuinely stopped caring what happened to him, which had taken time to arrive at, and which she was glad to have arrived at. Warren Eldridge was older and had reduced his operations and was rarely seen in town. The Double E had been partially sold off to various buyers, and some of those parcels had been bought by hardworking families who had nothing to do with the Eldridge history, and who would build their own stories on that land in their own good time. Martha Pruitt's boarding house continued to operate, and Martha continued to come to the Hayes farm with regularity, and had become Will's favorite audience for his elaborate descriptions of the cattle operation and Clara's preferred source of opinions about gardening, since Martha had opinions about everything and was not shy about sharing them. On an evening in August of 1889, Alfred and Lenora sat on their porch as they did most evenings when the day's work was done, in the chairs he had built over the winter of their second year, chairs designed for the specific comfort of people who intended to sit in them for many years, and the sky was going through its nightly transformation above the cedar hills, and the cattle were settled in the pasture, and the children were inside. Will in his bed reading by candlelight in the way he had recently adopted, and Clara already asleep with the wholehearted commitment to sleep that characterized everything she did. The evening air was warm and carried the smell of the peach orchard, which had come in well that summer, and of the dried grass and the cedar and the particular clean smell of the creek after a good summer of water. "I was thinking today," Lenora said. "What were you thinking?" Alfred asked. He was turning his coffee cup in his hands, a habit she had observed in him for 6 years now without it losing its quality of being simply him. "I was thinking about the morning I walked into Harlan's store and the room went quiet," she said, "the way it always used to do, and I was trying to remember the last time that happened." She paused. "I couldn't remember. It's been so long." "Probably about 3 years," he said. "That Tuesday in April when you went in with Will and he knocked over the pickle barrel." She laughed, because that was true and accurate and entirely Alfred. "The room didn't go quiet about me," she said. "The room went quiet about the pickle barrel. Most things in Redrock that require that much attention are deserving of it," he said. She looked at him in the evening light, at the face that she knew better than any face in the world by now, weathered and honest, and with those warm brown eyes that were exactly as direct as they had been the first morning she'd seen them, in Harlan's store over 6 years ago. "You said the brand was wrong," she said. He looked at her. Yes, you were right, she said. You were completely right. And I want to tell you that those words were the most important words anyone said to me in my life. Not because I didn't know it myself, but because hearing it said aloud clearly by someone who meant it. She stopped and then continued evenly. It was the beginning of things being actually right again. Not just survivable, actually right. Alfred set down his coffee cup and reached over and took her hand and held it. The brand was wrong, he said again, simply and without elaboration, and she understood that he would say it as many times as needed, that it was not a thing he had said once and moved on from, but a thing he had simply decided was true and would remain decided on indefinitely. She held his hand in the warm evening and listened to the sounds of her farm and her life, and thought about how many things had happened to bring her here, the terrible ones and the ordinary ones and the unexpected ones. And she thought that she would not unmake any of them if unmaking them meant losing this exact August evening with this exact man, and these children asleep inside, and the peach orchard full in the summer and the good solid house behind them. The stars were coming out over the Texas hills, the same stars that had always been there, and the land below them was hers and his and theirs together. And the name she wore was honestly earned and freely chosen. And the woman who wore it was not the ruined woman the county had once decided she was, had never been that woman at all. And the proof of it was accumulated in every year that had followed the morning a tall, direct, patient man had held a door in Harlan's store and said simply, "Pardon me, ma'am," and meant nothing by it except that she was worth stepping aside for. It had been enough. It had been more than enough. It had been the beginning of everything. Inside the house, Will put down his book and fell asleep, and Clara turned in her sleep with the confidence of a child who does not know what it is to be uncertain of her safety. And the fire in the kitchen banked slowly down to coals, and Alfred and Lenora sat on their porch in the summer dark and were quiet together in the way of people who have found, against considerable odds, the exact right place to be, and the exact right person to be there with. The peaches would be picked next week. The cattle were settled. The new calf that had been worrying them was doing well. The fall order of supplies was mostly placed. There was a school board meeting in October that Lenora had agreed to attend as a community member, which Alfred thought was long overdue and which she thought might be useful, and they had discussed it over supper with the practical thoroughness they brought to most things. The country around them was what it had always been, large and indifferent and beautiful, and they were small within it in the way that all people are small within a landscape that precedes them and will outlast them. And that smallness was not diminishment but proportion, the right relationship between a person and the world they inhabit. Alfred squeezed her hand and she squeezed back, and the night settled in around them with the cedar smell and the creek sound, and the stars coming fully into their own overhead, and the story of Lenora Crawford and Alfred Hayes, which had been a hard story in its first chapters and a good one in its later ones, went on in the best possible way that any story can go on, quietly, warmly. With work and children and seasons and all the ordinary days of a life lived fully and without apology in the country they had made their own. She was home. She had been home for years. And she was known there, truly known, by the one person who had always seen her clearly, not the brand they'd tried to put on her, not the ruination they'd tried to make her name mean, but the actual woman, Lenora Crawford Hayes, who was remarkable and had always been remarkable, and who had needed only one honest man to say so first.